What's up, everybody? I'm Stan, and welcome to Detail Comics, where we go over comics in detail. In this week's weekly one-shot, we're going to be talking about something that maybe not a lot of people know about, and that is how Pre-Flashpoint Superman became a part of DC Rebirth. So what we have is a situation where this is the Superman that is currently in DC Rebirth, and he is part of a previous continuity. And that's really kind of confusing, especially when you consider that New 52 Superman just really made his debut in 2011. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the time stream a little bit and figure out exactly what went on to get new Superman, old Superman again. So that's kind of going to be where we're starting off. So where we need to really dig back into is really the conclusion of the pre-Earth Prime. So Superman was a character that was originated back in the 1930s, and he's really the pinnacle, he's the original superhero, and for the longest period of time, we're talking about 905 issues of Action Comics was the same Superman. This is the Superman that was defeated by Doomsday, the death of Superman. He became electric in this kind of blue getup, and really what he did was he evolved through these things. He went through the first crisis, the crisis of infinite Earths. He went through the second crisis, the infinite crisis. He went through final crisis, and this is the Superman that has so much legacy, so much power, and so much promise. So what we see is that back in 2011, during Superman, over the last few issues of this entire run, J. Michael Straczynski is telling a story about Superman walking across the country, trying to determine whether the world really needs a Superman. So this story arc kind of concludes in Superman number 714, and then we also have Action Comics 905, which is telling a Doomsday Eradicator story, and these are really the last issues that we see pre-Flashpoint Superman at that point in time, because what happens is the Flashpoint event. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Flashpoint is a situation where Barry Allen has traveled back in time, saved his mom, and caused this chaotic restructuring of the universe. So, Superman was captured as a young boy, he was never really exposed to the sun, and he really was encapsulated inside this area that didn't really allow him to break out until Flash actually found him during this time frame. Batman was no longer really Batman, he was Thomas Wayne instead of Bruce Wayne because Bruce was killed instead of Bruce's parents. So there's a lot of different things that went on during Flashpoint, but at the culmination of Flashpoint, what we see is Barry Allen racing back in time to allow things to kind of congeal in terms of the universes, to really restructure themselves and bring themselves back to quote-unquote normal. However, what we see is the interactions of Pandora, which really brings about a different universe than what we really know at that point in time, because what happens is that the Earth Prime universe, the original universe, merges with the Vertigo universe and the Wildstorm universe, and that is what creates the New 52, or at least supposedly that's what created the New 52. So after the conclusion of Flashpoint, Barry Allen wakes up and he's completely fine. However, when we start off this New 52 scenario, we have a completely different cast of characters. So even though Batman's legacy is pretty much similar, except much more condensed in terms of time frames, Superman's legacy is entirely different. Jonathan Kent has been killed, Martha Kent has been killed, so Superman was raised as a very different kind of character. He was much more kind of antagonistic. He didn't really trust the government that was going on at that point in time. He didn't really trust people of authority. He was really more rebellious in nature. So Grant Morrison's take on the New 52 Superman, to begin with, this is the Superman that was in a t-shirt, jeans, and a cape, kind of taking on these kind of people as an anti-society, but really a savior of the folks. And before the end of, issue 6 or issue 7, he finally gained his Kryptonian armor and became the Superman that you saw in the Superman book when it originated. And this is where we see New 52 Superman. He is much younger, 5 to 10 years younger at this point in time than this older Superman. He doesn't necessarily have the kind of experience, he's not as refined, he's not as much a pinnacle or beacon of hope as this old Superman was. He didn't really have this kind of Boy Scout mentality. However, we're not here to talk about New 52 Superman, we're here to talk about the Superman in DC Rebirth. However, we can't talk about one without the other. As the New 52 moved along, there was this giant scale event, which is called Convergence. And if you want to kind of read that hot piece of garbage, you're more than welcome to. However, there is a much more concise version of that story that can be found in another title. And Convergence really told the story of all these kind of alternate dimension, alternate reality versions of these characters that are pulled together and they're kind of set on Telos to battle each other. And who do we find here? We find pre-Flashpoint Superman with Lois Lane, as well as their brand new son, Jonathan. And that's where we see pre-Flashpoint Superman for the first time in the DC Universe during this Convergence story. And then as we kind of conclude this thing, Brainiac, on a future version of Brainiac, has the option to send them anywhere that they need to go, but they know that they have to go back to the first crisis, so they send Superman, they send Parallax, they send, Barry Allen back there, Supergirl, so that way they can confront the Anti-Monitor, and they actually defeat him in probably one of the easiest and more convenient panels of destruction of the Anti-Monitor. They actually avert the first crisis, which resets the timeline. And then Superman is really kind of there at that point in time, but we don't know that yet as far as the Convergence is concerned. What we do is we get to kind of see these things unfold, and then during Dan Jurgens' storyline in Superman, Lois, and Clark, we actually get the story of how New 52 Superman has always had kind of a guardian angel, and that happens to be pre-Flashpoint Superman. Because during the events of Convergence, when everybody kind of went back to fight the Anti-Monitor, what we saw is that pre-Flashpoint Superman, Lois, and their son were left in this new universe. And this new universe is the parallel that Barry Allen created. So this is the merging of the Vertigo universes, the merging of the Wildstorm universe, and the regular Earth Prime universe to create this New 52 kind of scheme. And he's been here since the origination. So when we saw New 52 born, it was born out of the story of the Justice League. So this is the real kind of combining of the powers of, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Superman, Cyborg, all these kind of guys. The original launching of the New 52 took place in the Justice League title. And standing there in the background as they fought against Darkseid was Superman. And this is only days after he arrived here from the events of the first crisis and the timeline reset. So through this next several issues of Superman, Lois, and Clark, we get to see different events in time that have taken place that basically Superman, pre-Flashpoint Superman, has been involved in. He's created this entire scrapbook of all these events that he has solved or that he's participated in secrecy. He's hidden his powers and basically blended in to be a relatively average farmer in the backwoods of California. And we don't really actually see Superman interacting in the greater New 52 universe outside of this one particular Superman, Lois, and Clark series until we actually get to the final days of Superman. And this is the first time that Superman, pre-Flashpoint, and Superman, New 52 meet, and that's during the death run of New 52 Superman. During the events of Final Days of Superman, we not only see pre-Flashpoint Superman and New 52 Superman interacting, we actually see the essential passing of the torch between these two characters. And not necessarily in a very serious manner, it was more in a kind of honorary manner, because the actual conflict, the actual death of Superman didn't really affect pre-Flashpoint Superman that much. However, having known that these kind of things happened, or these kind of things occurred, he really understands where the situation is, and ultimately when we open up in Superman Rebirth as part of DC Rebirth, we actually see him kind of go through the steps to see if he can actually revive this New 52 Superman, because he still feels like a man outside of his own universe, because he really is. If we were to take a look at this in terms of a parallel timeline, then what we have is we have the original Earth Prime, and the original Earth Prime continues up until the points of Flashpoint. So that's where pre-Flashpoint Superman has been taken out of that particular universe. And then he's been thrust essentially back in time to a place in the timeline where the first crisis would have happened. However, this is, that explains really the youth of the other characters that are around him. The younger version of himself, the younger version of Batman, and everybody else. He feels like everyone is younger. So this could be 5 to 10 years prior to where we were taking the Flashpoint timeline. And then he is kind of survived in secrecy throughout this entirety of the New 52. From the origin story of Superman all the way through until the final days of Superman. Pre-Flashpoint Superman was essentially plucked from his own universe at a timeline just after Flashpoint. If Barry Allen hadn't done those kind of things and the Earth Prime universe continued to move forward, that is where we would have seen this Superman. He was plucked out during the Convergence storyline. He was thrust back to the original time where the first crisis took place. The timeline reset itself, and he was injected into the New 52 at the point in time where we all were introduced to the New 52, which was the first issue of Justice League and the real joining of the Justice League for the first time. And he's been in the entire New 52 universe ever since. That's really what's happened and why Pre-Flashpoint Superman is where he is in the DC Rebirth universe today. And it's really kind of convoluted, but I hope this shed a little bit of light on those kind of things. If you guys want to read more about it, I would definitely recommend reading Flashpoint just to get a little bit better idea. You can kind of skip Convergence because it is a little bit of a hot mess, and you can get most of the story from Superman, Lois, and Clark, which is an 8-part series written by Dan Jurgens. If you want to see where Pre-Flashpoint Superman meets up with New 52 Superman for the first time, that would be in the Final Days of Superman arc, which crosses over with 4 different comic books at the end of the New 52. And of course, DC Rebirth's Superman Rebirth is the best place to hop on for the brand new stories that are coming from Peter J. Tomasi and team. So that is the story of the Superman, but I want to know what you guys think, so hit me up in the comments down below and we can start that conversation and talk about any other kind of situations where Superman may or may not have intervened, and if there are any other kind of seeds planted throughout the New 52 for this. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe right there to get more news, reviews, and commentary on comic books, comic book movies, comic book TV shows, and games, and anything and everything inside the world of comics.